There was a long period in my life when I believed I was simply reacting to the world, not choosing, not deciding, just responding to whatever happened around me. If something went wrong, I felt annoyed. If someone disappointed me, I felt frustrated. If life felt unfair, I complained quietly, sometimes loudly, and I thought this was normal. I never asked myself whether I was part of the problem. I believed my reactions were justified. After all, things were difficult. People were careless. Life was demanding. Anyone would feel this way, I told myself. I didn't think of myself as a negative person. I thought of myself as realistic, honest, direct, someone who just said what others were thinking. I didn't see my reactions as harmful. I saw them as natural. When something annoyed me, I reacted immediately. When I felt misunderstood, I defended myself. When I felt tired, I withdrew. There was no pause between feeling and responding, no space to consider another option. I lived in that immediacy, and it felt efficient. I didn't hold things in. I didn't pretend. I said what I felt and moved on. At least, that's what I believed. Looking back, I see how often I carried tension without noticing it. How quickly small inconveniences became heavy emotions. How easily my mood shifted because of things outside my control. But at the time, I didn't question it. I thought this was just how adulthood felt: stress, pressure, responsibility. Everyone complained. Everyone reacted. So why should I be different? I didn't see that reacting constantly was exhausting me, and quietly exhausting the people around me as well. Relationships during that time were stable, but not light. Conversations often carried a certain edge, not arguments, just sharpness. A tone, a sigh, a quick response that closed a door instead of opening one. I didn't mean to push people away. I just didn't notice how often I did. I was busy managing my life, work, obligations, and daily routines. I didn't have time to examine my behavior. Self-reflection felt like a luxury, something for people with fewer problems. I thought survival came first, and everything else could wait. English, during those years, was very far away. Not difficult, not interesting, just irrelevant. It existed somewhere outside my life, in books, in other people's conversations, in opportunities that didn't feel meant for me. I didn't use English to express myself. I barely used it to think. My world was contained within familiar language, familiar complaints, and familiar reactions. Everything important could be said the way I had always said it. I didn't feel limited. I felt sufficient. I didn't imagine that language could shape how I think or how I respond. English felt unnecessary because I wasn't searching for new ways to understand myself. In truth, I wasn't searching at all. When something bothered me, I blamed circumstances. When something hurt, I blamed people. I rarely looked inward, not because I avoided it, but because it didn't occur to me. I assumed self-awareness would come later, when life was calmer, when things settled. Later became a familiar word again, a place where insight would eventually live. I didn't know that insight rarely waits for the perfect moment. It arrives when you are tired enough to listen. But at that time, I was still busy reacting, busy explaining, busy defending, busy telling myself that nothing needed to change. I thought growth meant achieving more, doing better, working harder. I didn't know that growth could also mean reacting less, listening more, pausing longer. Those ideas felt distant, unnecessary. almost impractical. I believed changing myself would mean betraying who I was. I told myself, this is just my personality. And personality, I believed, was fixed. So I adapted the world to my reactions, instead of adapting my reactions to the world. I didn't feel unhappy, but I didn't feel peaceful either. I lived in a constant low-level tension that felt normal, so normal that I stopped noticing it. English remained far away because I didn't need it to maintain this life. Nothing new was being built. Nothing old was being questioned. I was moving forward without changing direction, and for a long time that felt enough. I didn't know yet that this way of living would slowly begin to feel heavy, that reacting would start to feel tiring, that one day I would notice how much energy was being spent on frustration, on defense, on negativity I never intended to carry. But for now, I was still inside it, unaware, certain, convinced that the problem was always somewhere else, and that I, exactly as I was, did not need to change. The discomfort did not arrive as a crisis. It didn't stop my life or demand attention. It didn't announce itself in a way that forced me to pause. It appeared quietly, in moments that felt ordinary and easily dismissible. A conversation that ended too quickly. A reaction that lingered longer than it should have. A tension that stayed with me even after everything else had already moved on. At first, I blamed circumstances. Work was stressful. People were careless. Life was demanding. Anyone would feel this way, I told myself. These explanations felt familiar and comforting. They allowed me to move on without questioning anything. But something felt different now. The discomfort didn't disappear after I reacted. It stayed quietly present, following me into moments that were supposed to feel neutral. I noticed how often I replayed situations in my mind. Things I said, things I wished I had said, things that shouldn't have mattered, but did. I began to feel tired, not physically, but emotionally. Tired of explaining, tired of reacting, tired of carrying small frustrations as if they were necessary parts of my daily life. This tiredness didn't make me sad. It made me curious. I started asking myself questions I hadn't asked before. Why did this bother me so much? Why did I react so quickly? Why did I always feel the need to defend myself? These questions didn't come all at once. They appeared slowly, often when I least expected them, and I didn't like them because they pointed inward. I had spent years looking outward for explanations. Now, something was quietly asking me to look at myself. I resisted at first, not intentionally, but instinctively. Self-examination felt uncomfortable and unnecessary. I told myself I didn't have time for this kind of thinking. There were responsibilities to manage, routines to maintain, and problems that felt more urgent. But the discomfort kept returning. In quiet moments, when I was alone, when no one was asking anything of me, it became harder to ignore. I began to notice patterns. Certain situations always triggered the same response. Certain people always brought out the same tone in me. My reactions felt predictable, almost rehearsed. That realization made me uneasy. I didn't like the idea that I was repeating myself, that my responses were automatic and unexamined. I had always believed I was being honest, but now I wondered if I was being aware. There is a difference. Honesty without awareness can become harm, even when it is unintended. That thought stayed with me. I began to notice how my reactions affected others, not dramatically, but subtly. A conversation ending earlier than planned, a change in tone, a hesitation before someone spoke. These were small things, easy to dismiss, but once noticed, they were hard to forget. I realized that my reactions didn't just express my feelings. They shaped the space around me. They set the tone for conversations and, over time, for relationships. That realization felt heavy because it meant I was responsible for more than I thought. I wasn't just reacting to the world, I was influencing it. English during this period was still distant, but it began to appear in unexpected ways. I found myself listening more carefully when others spoke, especially when they paused, when they searched for words. I noticed how meaning often lived in what was not said. That made me think. In my own language, I rarely paused. I spoke quickly, reacted quickly, and filled silence without thinking. I realized I was uncomfortable with not knowing what to say. So I said something. English, strangely, made silence acceptable. People paused. They searched. They corrected themselves. And no one judged them. That observation stayed with me. It showed me another way of being, a slower way. A way where reactions were not immediate and pauses were allowed. I didn't consciously apply this to my life, but the idea settled inside me. I began to pause a little longer. Not always, just sometimes. Before reacting, before speaking, before defending myself. Those pauses felt awkward and unnatural, but also relieving. They gave me a moment of choice. For the first time, I saw that reactions were not inevitable. They were habits, and habits could be examined. This realization did not transform me. It didn't make me calm or patient overnight. But it opened a door, a small one, just enough to let light in. I stopped assuming that my first response was the right one. I began to ask myself, what else is possible? That question felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable, but also necessary. I didn't yet know how to change. I only knew that continuing the same way felt exhausting. The discomfort had done its work. It had made me aware. And awareness, once it arrives, does not leave easily. It waits, it watches, and it prepares you for the next step, even when you are not ready to take it yet. The changes did not arrive as decisions. I didn't wake up one morning and promise myself to be different. Nothing that clear ever happened. There was no dramatic resolution, no clear line separating who I was from who I would become. What changed were the small, almost unnoticeable moments where I didn't react as quickly as before. Not because I was calm, but because something inside me hesitated. I began to notice that hesitation. At first, it felt uncomfortable, like standing between two steps, one familiar and one unknown. The familiar step was reacting immediately, explaining, defending, responding with tension. The unknown step was waiting, even if only for a few seconds. Those seconds felt longer than they were, stretching time in a way I wasn't used to. But they gave me something I had never experienced before: choice. I realized that not reacting right away did not mean I was weak. It meant I was present. That realization surprised me. I had always believed strength meant having a response, having something ready to say. Now I saw that strength could also mean not saying anything yet. In everyday situations, these pauses were barely visible. Someone spoke sharply. I felt the familiar urge to respond. And then I waited just long enough to feel the urge pass through me instead of controlling me. Sometimes I still reacted. Sometimes I didn't. But even when I did, it felt different, less automatic, more chosen. I noticed how often my reactions were driven by a need to be understood, to be right, to protect my version of events. When I paused, that need softened. I began to listen more carefully, not to respond, but to understand. That shift was subtle, but it changed the tone of conversations. People spoke a little more freely. Silences lasted a little longer. And strangely, those silences felt safer. I didn't announce these changes or explain them. I simply practiced them quietly in traffic, at work, at home, in moments that usually triggered me. I didn't always succeed, but even partial success felt relieving. Less energy was spent on resistance. Less tension was carried from one moment to the next. I began to feel lighter, not happier, just less burdened. English, during this period, returned to my awareness in a quiet way, not as something I needed to learn, but as something that reflected what I was practicing. In English, I often had to pause, search for words, and accept imperfection. I couldn't react quickly, even if I wanted to. At first, this felt limiting. Now, it felt helpful. English forced me to slow down, to think before speaking, to accept that what I said might not be perfect and that this was okay. That acceptance began to spread. I stopped expecting myself to respond perfectly in every situation. I allowed myself to be unsure, to say I don't know, or let me think. These phrases felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, but they created space for honesty, reflection, and calmer conversations. I noticed how others responded to this change, not with praise or comments, but with ease. Conversations felt less tense. Disagreements felt less personal. Even when opinions differed, the space between us felt intact. That mattered to me. I realized that many conflicts were not about content, but about tone, timing, and how quickly defensiveness appeared. By slowing down, I wasn't avoiding conflict. I was reshaping it. I was giving it room to breathe. These changes were not dramatic, and no one pointed them out, but I felt them in my body, in my thoughts, and in how quickly stress left after a difficult moment. I began to notice how much of my energy had been spent on constant reaction, and how draining that had been. Letting go of immediate response felt like rest, not passive rest, but active rest, the kind that comes from not fighting everything. I didn't become a different person. I became a quieter version of myself. One who listened more than spoke, who observed before responding, and who accepted that not every moment required a reaction. This way of being felt more sustainable and more honest. I didn't feel like I was performing. I felt like I was present. These small changes began to affect how I saw myself. I was no longer someone constantly reacting. I was someone learning to choose, and choice changed everything, not all at once, but slowly and consistently. I didn't yet know where this path would lead. I only knew that it felt lighter than the one I had been on, and that was enough to keep going. The changes were small, almost invisible, but they were real. And they were preparing me for a deeper understanding, one that would come not from effort, but from reflection, a realization about what it truly means to become better. For a long time, I thought becoming better meant becoming different. someone calmer, kinder, more patient, more controlled. I imagined change as a visible transformation, something others would notice, something I could point to and say, "That is who I am now." I believed improvement would look obvious, clear, and measurable from the outside, but that is not how it happened. Becoming better did not feel like becoming someone else. It felt like becoming quieter inside myself, less reactive, less defensive, less certain that I already understood everything. Instead of adding new qualities, I began to remove old habits. I started to see that improvement was not about fixing flaws, but about not feeding them, about not giving every irritation my full attention and not letting every discomfort decide my response. I stopped asking, "How do I become better?" and started asking, "What can I stop doing?" Stop reacting immediately. Stop explaining myself when it wasn't needed. Stop carrying tension longer than necessary. These changes did not make life easier, but they made it clearer. I noticed how much of my energy had been spent trying to control outcomes, trying to be right, trying to be understood, trying to protect my image. Letting go of that effort felt unfamiliar, but it also felt honest. I realized that being a better person did not mean never feeling anger, frustration, or impatience. It meant not letting those feelings drive everything. It meant acknowledging them without obeying them. That distinction changed how I lived. I didn't become softer in every situation, but I became slower. And slowness created space to listen, to reconsider, and to choose a response that aligned more closely with who I wanted to be. By this time, English had found its place in my life, not as a goal or a skill to master, but as a practice of pausing, of thinking before speaking, and of accepting imperfection without withdrawing. In English, I often spoke imperfectly, and nothing terrible happened. People listened. Conversations continued. Connection remained. That taught me something important. Being understood is not about saying things perfectly. It is about being present while you say them. That lesson returned to my own language. I became less afraid of awkward moments, less afraid of not having the right words, and less afraid of silence. Silence no longer felt like failure. It felt like space. I began to value presence over performance, listening over responding, staying over winning. These were not dramatic shifts. They didn't change my life overnight, but they changed how my days felt: calmer, lighter, more intentional. I stopped measuring myself against an ideal version of who I should be. Instead, I started paying attention to who I was becoming through small choices: how I responded when interrupted, how I listened when disagreed with, how I treated myself when I made mistakes. Becoming better was not about progress. It was about alignment, living closer to my values, even when it was uncomfortable. Especially then, I learned that growth does not announce itself. It happens quietly, in moments no one sees, in pauses, in restraint, in decisions not to escalate. If you are listening to this and wondering whether you are changing, I want to say this gently: you may not notice it while it is happening. Change often feels like nothing, like doing less, like stepping back. But that does not mean it is not real. Becoming better is rarely about adding more. It is about removing what no longer serves you: unnecessary reactions, unnecessary defenses, unnecessary urgency. If English feels difficult, slow, or uncomfortable, perhaps it is offering you the same invitation: to slow down, to accept imperfection, and to stay present even when you are unsure. Language, like growth, is not about perfection. It is about willingness, the willingness to speak, to listen, and to remain. I still react sometimes. I still feel frustration. I still make mistakes. But I no longer believe these moments define me. They inform me. They remind me where attention is needed. And attention is where change begins. I don't claim to be a better person in any dramatic sense. I am simply more aware, more intentional, and more willing to pause. And that, for me, is enough. This is not the end of the story. It is the way the story continues quietly, daily, one response at a time. Thank you for staying with this story, for listening without rushing. And if you take one thing with you, let it be this: becoming better does not mean becoming perfect. It means becoming present. And presence, practiced gently, changes everything.